It was a late August afternoon in Ohio. The air was heavy with the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the neighborhood kids were riding bikes up and down the street. Margaret, dressed in a light cotton blouse and white sun hat, stood by her roses, trimming a few dried petals. Gardening had always been her therapy since her husband passed away 5 years earlier. On the porch sat Lily, her 10-year-old granddaughter, braiding her doll's hair. Every now and then, she looked up at Margaret with the innocent eyes only children have. "Grandma," Lily called softly. Margaret turned with a smile. "Yes, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, glanced at the street to make sure no one was watching, and then leaned forward, her small hands cupped around her mouth as if she were about to reveal a dangerous secret. In a whisper, she said, "Grandma, Mom, and Dad want to take all your money." The words hit Margaret like a slap. She froze, the pruning shears slipping slightly from her hand. "Lily, what did you say?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily shrugged nervously and quickly went back to playing with her doll, as if she hadn't said anything at all. Margaret stood there, staring at her roses, her heart suddenly beating too fast. The neighborhood still looked the same, quiet, safe, familiar, but everything inside her had shifted. That night, Margaret tossed and turned in bed. She kept seeing Lily's little face, so serious, whispering words that no child should carry. Her daughter Susan had always been loving, though sometimes impatient. David, her son-in-law, was practical, ambitious, and often talked about money, too much, perhaps. They had a good life, a nice 2-story house, 2 cars, vacations every summer. Still, she remembered little remarks here and there. "Mom, you should think about updating your will. Don't leave things messy for us later. What are you going to do with all that savings? You can't take it with you." At the time, she brushed them off as normal family talk. But now, with Lily's warning, they felt heavier, sharper, more sinister. Margaret turned on her lamp, sat up, and stared at the small framed photo of her late husband, Robert. "What if they're really planning something, Bob?" she whispered. "What if Lily is right?" The silence of the room gave her no answers. The following Saturday, Susan and David came over for lunch. Margaret prepared chicken casserole, just like Susan loved when she was a child. The meal began with laughter and small talk. Lily sat quietly, picking at her food. After dessert, David leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. "Mom," he began casually, you really should consider transferring the deed of the house to Susan's name now. It'll save us a lot of paperwork later." Susan nodded. "It's just practical, Mom. You'll still live here, of course. Nothing would change." Margaret felt a cold shiver down her spine. She forced a polite smile, but her hand trembled slightly as she set her cup down. "Well," she said, carefully choosing her words, "I've always managed fine on my own. I don't see any rush." David's smile tightened. Susan quickly changed the subject, but Margaret noticed the way they exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. When they left that evening, Lily lingered behind, hugging her grandmother tightly. "Be careful, Grandma," she whispered again. The next afternoon, Margaret sat with Lily in the backyard swing, the late summer sun casting golden streaks across the lawn. "Sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "the other day you told me something, about your mom and dad. Do you remember?" Lily's face turned pale. She nodded slowly. "Can you tell me why you said that?" Margaret asked, stroking her granddaughter's hair. Lily bit her lip. I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. Daddy said they needed to make sure you gave them your house and money before it was too late. Mommy said she would convince you. Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to cry, but she held her composure for Lily's sake. You were very brave to tell me, sweetheart. Thank you. Lily looked at her grandmother with worried eyes. Don't tell them I told you, please. They'll get mad at me. Margaret hugged her tightly, fighting back tears. I promise. It'll be our secret. Inside, though, Margaret knew things could never go back to normal. The following Sunday, Susan called Margaret, insisting they all have dinner together. It'll be nice, Mom, she said over the phone. We don't spend enough time as a family. Margaret agreed, but her stomach tightened. She knew it wouldn't be just a casual dinner. That evening, the dining table was filled with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. David poured wine for himself and Susan, while Margaret quietly sipped water. Lily sat silently, poking her fork into her food, sensing the tension. Halfway through the meal, David set down his glass and leaned forward. Mom, let's be honest here. You're getting older. Managing finances, the house, the bills, it's a lot. Don't you think it would be easier to let us handle it for you? Susan chimed in, her tone sweet but firm. We just want what's best for you, Mom. You shouldn't have to worry anymore. If you signed some papers, everything could be simpler. Margaret's fork froze midair. She looked at her daughter, then at David, and finally at Lily, who was staring at her plate, her little hands trembling. Taking a deep breath, Margaret placed her utensils down. I appreciate your concern, she said slowly, but I've managed my life for 72 years. I'm not about to hand it over now. David's jaw tightened. You're being stubborn. We're just trying to help. Margaret's voice grew colder. No. You're trying to take what isn't yours. The table went silent. Susan's cheeks flushed red. Mom. How can you say that? Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, gathering her plate. Dinner is over. The days after the confrontation were heavy with silence. Susan stopped calling. David didn't visit. Margaret felt the distance growing like a wall between her and her only daughter. At church on Sunday, neighbors greeted her warmly, but she couldn't bring herself to share what was happening. How could she tell anyone that her own child was plotting against her? At home, the loneliness grew sharper. Nights were the worst. Margaret often sat in her recliner, clutching Robert's old flannel shirt, whispering to the photo on the mantelpiece, "Why does it hurt so much when the people you love betray you?" One afternoon, Susan appeared unannounced. She didn't smile, didn't hug her mother. She walked straight to the living room and said, "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. David and I only want to make sure everything is organized. If something happens to you, do you want your house going through probate? Do you want strangers deciding what happens to your money?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I want my choices respected. That's what I want." Susan's eyes hardened. "Then you're leaving me no choice." Before Margaret could respond, Susan stormed out, slamming the door. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a law office. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter stated that Susan and David were concerned for her mental capacity and were considering filing for guardianship, claiming she was no longer fit to manage her own affairs. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She sat down at the kitchen table, the letter shaking in her hands. They weren't just trying to pressure her anymore, they were preparing to take everything legally. Lily came over that weekend. Margaret showed her the letter. Tears welled up in the little girl's eyes. "Grandma, that's not fair. You're fine. You're smarter than Daddy." Margaret hugged her tightly. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes, people will do anything for money, even hurt the ones they should love most." That night, Margaret decided she needed help. She couldn't fight this battle alone. The next morning, Margaret visited her old friend Helen, a retired lawyer who lived 2 streets away. Helen had always been sharp, outspoken, and fiercely loyal. Margaret handed her the letter. Helen read it carefully, then looked up, her eyes blazing. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. But you're not alone, Margaret. We'll fight this." Helen guided her step by step, gathering financial records, updating her will, and even filing a document to ensure that no one could claim guardianship without a court battle. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a sense of relief. She wasn't powerless anymore. When Susan called again, demanding a meeting, Margaret calmly replied, "From now on, any conversation about my finances goes through my lawyer." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Months later, Susan and David followed through with their petition. The case went to probate court. Margaret sat nervously at the wooden table, Helen by her side, while Susan and David sat opposite, whispering to their attorney. The judge listened carefully to both sides. Susan testified, her voice dripping with false concern, "My mother forgets things. She leaves the stove on. We're only trying to protect her." Margaret stood, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Your Honor, I manage my bills, my home, and my health on my own. My daughter and her husband aren't protecting me. They're trying to control me." Helen presented evidence, bank statements, medical records, even testimonies from neighbors who confirmed Margaret's independence. Finally, the judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson is competent and fully capable of managing her affairs. The petition is denied." Susan's face flushed with anger. David clenched his fists under the table. Margaret, meanwhile, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. After the court ruling, Susan and David stopped visiting. Weeks passed with no phone calls, no texts. Margaret's heart ached, but she refused to chase after them. One Saturday morning, Lily showed up at her doorstep with a small backpack. "Mom and Dad are mad, Grandma," she whispered. "But I don't care. I love you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her granddaughter tightly. "You'll always have a place here, Lily. Always." Life moved forward. The roses bloomed again, brighter than ever. Margaret still missed the daughter she once knew, but she had protected herself, and taught Lily a powerful lesson, that love is not proven by words, but by actions. As she sat on her porch swing, the autumn breeze brushing her face, Margaret finally felt peace. She had faced betrayal, stood her ground, and kept her dignity. And in her heart, she knew she had given Lily more than money could ever buy, the truth.